Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined today by Josh Blank, Research Director of said Texas Politics Project. Happy late morning.
Happy late morning.
You know, weather's changing.
I was going to
nice.
say, I was thinking
nice
for
there.
small talk, I was like, it's a beautiful day.
Yeah, a little crisp, but very nice.
I like it, though. It's in the right place.
Yeah, we'll be yearning for days like this before too much longer.
Very soon.
So, we thought today we would look at the intersection of two stories with a Texas nexus that are about the intersection of state and federal authority. These are stories that seem like they just won't go away. Not to foreshadow, one I think for pretty good reasons, right. Another maybe for reasons, but less good reasons perhaps, but we'll get to that. And these two stories are, I don't know if you're laughing because that was restrained or because I couldn't, because I jumped the gun.
No, I'm just trying to ponder. I don't know. Okay.
So, these two stories are are linked. The fight over Texas Senate Bill 4 from the special session, which was passed into law by the legislature last year. And also the uptick in attention to Texas nationalism, separatism, secession, choose your moniker. Independence in recent months. And we can start with the news hook here. So late yesterday afternoon, seemingly a couple of minutes late, but I don't know. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito issued an order that extended a previous order that blocked Texas from enforcing SB 4, the Border Security / Immigration Enforcement Bill. We'll talk about that in a minute. Unlike his last order, this order had no expiration date. And so it's now in place pending further action by Alito or by the court per the order. Now, some background. SB 4 passed during the fourth special session created two state crimes for migrants who cross into Texas illegally. Illegal entry from a foreign country, a Class B misdemeanor with a jail term of up to 6 months and a $2,000 fine, and illegal re-entry into the state from a foreign country, also a Class A misdemeanor with up to 1 year in jail and a $4,000 fine for repeat offenders. Now, the penalty for both could escalate to felonies for migrants who had previously been convicted of certain crimes, including a felony or 2 misdemeanor drug convictions. The law also allowed state judges to issue deportation orders, and that should be kind of underlined, for migrants if they agree to return to the foreign nation from which they entered Texas, which
could be
hard to imagine is not going to be Mexico in this case. Now, the bill was originally scheduled to take effect on March 5th, but its implementation was temporarily blocked by U.S. District Court Judge David Ezra. Then on February 29th, Ezra ruled that the law was likely unconstitutional for reasons that for a lot of people were pretty obvious. That is that the federal government has jurisdiction over immigration matters. Very quickly, Texas appealed. The Fifth U.S. Court of Appeals gave Texas permission to enforce SB 4 while it considered a review of the lower court ruling. This, of course, was also appealed in very short order.
Well, and also notably when they did that, they put a stay on their own ruling of, I think it was 14 days, which basically said, okay, in 14 days, this law, the enforcement of this law can go back into effect while the litigation takes place. Now, what that did was, in a lot of ways, it put pressure on the Supreme Court.
Right. And so Texas appealed. And then that happened. Then the Biden administration and civil rights groups asked the Supreme Court to halt enforcement of the law until its constitutionality could be determined. This led to this order, this series of orders from Alito, who is the judge for this region, including this Monday order that paused the law again. And as I said a minute ago, this time indefinitely. So what about the politics of all this? And of course, the public opinion context, because that's what we do. Politically, I think it's safe to say that the bill was really the centerpiece of the governor's border security agenda when the legislature was in session. There was also, the increased money that they passed during the regular for wall construction to further fund Operation Lone Star. But, I think the thing to notice about the kind of politics of this, right, is that, and this is, very evident in the legislative debate about it, this was destined to be challenged on constitutional grounds. And so here we are.
Yeah, I was thinking, just going back a beat, what you said about the centerpiece, and it's interesting. Like, I don't disagree. Although I think, the centerpiece in a lot of ways, to my mind, was the continuation of Operation Lone Star, sort of the beefing up of state border security. And in some ways, this was kind of necessary. Like, it was I think in a lot of ways, a necessary underpiece of it, which is to say, if we start expending tons and tons of state resources on border security enforcement, which expands beyond the border into sort of immigration enforcement, well, ultimately, you need to provide those officers with some kind of law.
Enforcement power.
Well,
right.
It's a fancier way to put it.
And not make this a matter of us cooperating with the federal government and still them retaining sole authority.
Yeah, and there's a little piece of backstory to the trajectory of this, which was, remember, the state was recently trying to convict basically migrants on trespassing charges on private property, right? So a lot of the so the way that Operation Lone Star turned into enforcement out beyond the Texas-Mexico border was to say, if we catch basically migrants on someone's property, we're going to charge them with trespassing. Now, ultimately, that's not a great fit. But what they did was they made sort of a broader law against trespassing, but now in the state, illegally entering from Mexico, it becomes now you're trespassing in the sort of broader sense, which is why it's also a misdemeanor. All these things, but this basically gave them the teeth to actually enforce, I think in some ways, to really make all the money they're spending on security and enforcement is actual give some, as you said, an enforcement mechanism.
Yeah, well, and not to be, too abstract about it, but it also enabled them to do this not as agents of the federal government,
right?
But with the imprimatur of state authority, and I think that's something we can pick up on later. Mm-hmm. But I do think that was that was at work here.
Well, yeah, and I think that was at work. I mean, what you can see, especially in the district judge's ruling against Texas originally, one of the arguments he took head on was the state's argument that it was being invaded and therefore that it had special additional powers, which the district judge said essentially you've done nothing, to meet any sort of threshold or burden of proof that that's actually what's going on here, and I don't even know where we would start.
Yeah, and that was an interesting argument. It's a good point to raise because there was this sense of wanting to assume state authority, but not completely abandon the fact that within the scheme of federalism in the Constitution, there was some, however thin, rationale and authorization for this. Right, and that of course dovetailed as we go to the politics of this. Right. With the critique of the Biden administration and the argument that, that has become the talking point nationally and at the state level that the Biden administration has abdicated responsibility, has established open borders, et cetera.
Right. And so ultimately, when this law was being considered and this argument was, the arguments about whether, about, I was going to say whether it was constitutional or not, but rather, how unconstitutional it might be, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, this feels pretty familiar. I mean, we see this, we've seen this in a lot of different policy domains. Sometimes, I think historically, though not recently, the legislature has been reticent to go down the road of something that's going to solely lead to expensive legal challenges, but they've become a lot more comfortable with it over time. We'd say around abortion, certainly, right, is one. You see something voting is another. And here's another space where, again, it's almost surprising it's taken this long, although this isn't the first instance of this, where, the politics of this play out pretty well. You have a policy that's overwhelmingly popular among especially Republican voters. We asked in February of this year, do you support or oppose the state of Texas making it a state crime for an undocumented immigrant to be in Texas in most circumstances? This was our, sort of abstraction but simplification of what the law would essentially do. Overall, 60% of Texas voters supported this, 33% opposed. 88% of Republicans supported this, 68% strongly, so 2/3 strongly supported making basically a state crime about basically illegal border crossing. And so on the one hand, the law in and of itself, slam dunk, right? I mean, 60% support, Almost 90% of Republicans, a third of Democrats said they supported this. Hispanics were split 45-47, which is actually an interesting result in and of itself. But, as we've talked about before here, the dynamics are, okay, so this law gets passed when local judge knocks it down because of its sort of clear constitutional problems. Fifth Circuit was a bit of a toss-up as to what they were going to do. They took a very political route, I think, and just said, no, this is fine, but the Supreme Court has to weigh, and they have 14 days. Supreme Court then said, well, probably not fine, or at the very least, we're going to put this on hold until everything plays out, which is sort of the more regular way to do this. But in the meantime, what does the Biden administration do? What are Democrats doing? They're arguing against state enforcement of, basically immigration laws, state enforcement or state efforts, let's say, to deal with the migrant crisis. However you want to frame it, you're putting this conflict up and again in a way that I think Republicans here are very comfortable with.
Well, and to telescope out, while at the same time, with the other hand, trying to get Congress to act and ceding ground in Congress, on at least on the narrow level in the narrow scope of migrants that are here seeking asylum. And even as we speak now, there appears to be a deal made in Congress with increased enforcement money for DHS.
Yeah.
And apparently that deal was cut last night. And so I think it does make sense that, all of this, falls, under the broader umbrella that has really been stimulated by Operation Lone Star, as you're sort of laying out. And it kind of, it's colliding with, to date, widely accepted understandings of the division of authority on the border, but is now tapping into, some of these other elements, and it's gotten a lot of attention. I mean, when we ask people, some of the, when we ask these batteries on the survey, we go round and round about these batteries behind the scene about, the science. How much have you heard? How much have you heard in the news about different stories? I think it's hard for us to not and look, we do sometimes. We presuppose where we're going to get variance.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And so some things, we include, and a lot of that is the comparison between what, how much more people are paying attention to national politics than to state politics.
Or sometimes how much more partisans of, Republicans are paying attention or Democrats or vice versa.
But in this, when we looked at, when we asked in our February poll about how much people had heard about this, most everybody had heard about it.
Yeah, and to be clear, when we say this, we're not talking about migration to the southern border, which again is also very, very, very specifically. We asked how much they had heard about conflicts between Texas and the federal government over immigration enforcement at the southern border. And I will say this, we've been doing this for a while now, and if we were talking about a similar situation, let's say 10 years ago, even, I honestly think the salience would be a lot lower. I think we could probably, we could look around at some data, maybe see if we could pinpoint that. We definitely noticed in the last poll a huge uptick in attention to the border, a huge uptick in Democratic concerns around border issues, and I think a set of attitudes that were a little bit more varied than maybe people would have expected just with some sloppy thinking, is how I'm going to put it these days.
Right.
But at the same time, I think it was easy in some ways for a lot of people, especially a lot of Democrats, and even just sort of, I think even national kind of coverage of it, to sort of dismiss a lot of this, dismiss sort of, the governor's having an event in Brownsville, in Brackettville, in McAllen, in Eagle Pass, right? What, and that's sort of, and it's like, where is that being telecast to? Well, it's being telecast to Midland and Plano and in these sorts of places. And that politics worked, but it felt very localized and targeted. It's kind of out of the jar now, right? Now it's really permeating. I think it's permeating both parties. It's not simply, I think, and I don't want to say simply, but it's not, it's not primarily a campaign message.
Political leverage at the state level.
Yeah, it's not primarily for political, thank you. It's not primarily for political leverage at the state level anymore. It is part of this much, much broader discussion. And as it's become part of a much broader discussion, itself has invited in a lot more, I think, players and a lot more perspectives and a lot more just, noise, right?
I don't know if you, in my view that comes from, that's got multiple sources that make it tricky to kind of explain. Not tricky, but tricky to be comprehensive in explaining it, because I think we find ourselves on it here and in writing and in talking to people about it. I always have to say, look, there is a measurable increase in the scale of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely.
Right. And so that's, part of it. But I mean, there is also, the degree to which border security and immigration and as we always, and identity related issues, shall we say, are all feeding into this. And it's interesting. I mean, because it really, in some ways, it underlines the position of a lot of Texas media figures and, I don't really want to call it the intelligentsia because it's not what I'm sort of implying here. But, the idea that, if it's a problem in Texas, eventually, the rest of the world will notice because Texas is such a leader.
Right.
But in this case, there has been an interesting kind of, circularity to the fact that, this is a nationalization of this issue. And there's an interesting kind of feedback loop that's going back and forth between Texas and national politics now over the last, it's hard not to identify, say that, Donald Trump has played a big role in this, right?
Yeah.
In terms of his elevation of the issue. And now that there is actually an objective, problem that is, very hard for anybody to ignore or downplay or say that this is being exaggerated doesn't mean that everybody that ever saying something about it is telling the truth.
Yeah.
But the flow is bigger. And so we're seeing this kind of
and the current
manifestation
the currents are more
of
varied.
This. Yeah. And it's just, it's like it's the story, and this is too trite or too trivialize it, but the story is really ripened politically in a way that's very interesting if you follow it over time.
Right, and I think the one thing piece I would add to that is to say, you talk about sort of this feedback loop that used to be very, contained in some ways within the state. I mean, yes, there's sort of lobbing bombs of the federal government if Democrats are in office and that kind of thing, but it was still, primarily the goal of serving kind of state level politics, and in some ways that there's sort of a loss of control over that at this point, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking about it.
Because once the national environment, so once it becomes sort of a nationalized issue and you've got, mayors from cities far away responding to it and you've got the president making a mess about it, you've got
the former president.
You've got former president talking about it. You've got, basically the Democratic nominee for U.S. Senate, admonishing his own party's president about it. Ultimately, you're talking about something very different. And the reason I think it matters to us, again, we're most comfortable in the realm of public opinion, we talk about this a lot, is what does this do at the elite level when we think about elite level communications and the kind of messages voters are receiving. Now, Republicans are receiving, many of the same messages. It's just been, ramped up and the attention's been expanded even further. So there are more players getting involved in the space, which we'll get to. Among Democrats, a lot of them are kind of coming to the issue now and they are looking for leadership, right? They are trying to figure out, okay, well, what is the position that's sort of, as I'll put it as, I'm putting my quote fingers now, a good Democrat. What does a good Democrat look like on these issues? And that's actually being, I think what's interesting, I was having a beer conversation with a friend of mine, who's a, I can say clearly Republican, and we were talking about this issue. And I was sort of saying, a lot of, the way that people think about Democrats on this is sort of due to, I think in a lot of ways, just lazy thinking. And I liken it to, we wrote a piece years ago about Hispanic attitudes in Texas towards immigration. And part of it was a lot of people, I think 10 years ago used to sort of kind of blithely say, well, clearly, most Hispanics are for just kind of open borders. And it's like, whoa, and that's just not right. Okay. Yeah. And we can go into that, but not today. Okay. Well, same thing. I think there's a lot of sloppy thinking going around that sort of has this idea that there's this sort of Democratic position on this. It's like, they're, totally humanitarian driven, open borders, whatever. And most of that is honestly Republicans talking about what they think Democrats think in the absence of Democrats actually spending any time talking about this issue or really thinking about it. And that's changing now, and that's really has a big impact.
Well, I think what I would add to that is, the Democrats that are talking about it tend to be more from the progressive wing of the party, which are more likely to fit your, sort of thumbnail characterization of all Democrats. And so the Democratic position has been, very much shaped by the progressive wing that focuses on the issue.
And that's perfect because, again, those progressives are still the elites we're talking about.
Yeah.
But the point is that in some ways, they are in many, they they do represent sort of the fringe of the party. Just as Republicans on the fringe of their party don't necessarily speak for all Republicans on every issue, I'd say the same is probably true for these Democrats. The only issue is there's no counterweight here. I mean, for Republicans, what the people on the fringe say about immigration and what people say in, quote, let's say the middle, wherever that is, it's not terribly different.
Yeah, I think it'd be worth going back and looking at the issue positions on this among Democrats over time. Because I'm not, as I'm thinking about this, I mean, I think it's inattention to the issue that.
This is the thing.
Within the party,
but this
right?
is the nuance I think that's so important here, and this was going back where we actually started on this, which is with salience, right?
Yeah.
And this is one of those things that I think is really important in studying public opinion. We talk about it all the time. I was talking about yesterday to a college class, right? It's very easy to misinterpret public opinion when you assume that everybody has an opinion on every question you ask them about.
Right.
And the reality is, and I say this, and I say it somewhat hyperbolically, but I'll stick by it. Most people don't think about most things because they think about the few things they care about, right? And to the extent that, you go and you ask Democrats, what they think about an issue or where they stand on a policy proposition on an issue that's not high on their list, and if anything, they may not have thought much about because it's not even in competition with the other issues that Democrats tend to care about. You might end up, seeing, again, I think, a set of responses that does point towards a more, let's say liberal position towards the border. But then you have to ask yourself, is this based on thought? Is this based on the messages they're getting from elites? Is this based on sort of a general sense of, well, if I'm a Democrat, I guess I'm for this.
Anyway, what's going on with abortion?
Right. And those are different things, right? And I think right now we're actually in this really interesting space because
Democrats are paying more attention.
Democrats are paying more attention, and Democratic elites are trying to figure out how to both respond to that attention but also lead in a political environment.
Well, they're not getting, to the extent that you're a Democrat going, oh, what should I, and we should think of, people don't do this necessarily consciously.
Yeah.
But the mechanism is, you look around and see what other like-minded people and what you think of as like-minded elites are saying. And the elite messaging has been, for Democrats, a combination of divided and a moving target.
Well, I'll add one thing. When you said, the most notable voices are the most. You said something I didn't think you were going to say. The most notable voices are the most progressive, I'd say, or they're the most conservative. It's people like Henry Cuellar and people with sort of completely, almost anachronistic views within the Democratic Party. And so, but neither of those are actually representative of
Well, and Cuellar's an interesting position, an interesting case as we speak, because he's gone from being, kind of the dissident voice to somebody that, is now getting a lot of attention as somebody who was maybe ahead of the game on this, that is now being listened to by the president and by and is more active in Congress. Now, part of that is just, the distortion of media coverage that, people, Cuellar is a good story.
No, I know. I'm thinking, Cuellar is always a good story. So
one way or the other.
One way or the other. But that's a good point. I mean, I think the only thing I'm kind of furrowing my brow at is the idea that he was ahead of the game. It's more like,
Well, I'm not saying he was, but that's how it's now being portrayed.
Well, no, that's what I would disagree with. But yes. But
voice in the he was a voice in the wilderness, and now,
But what I would say is, just to reinforce the point, I think he was portrayed as a voice in a wilderness because there was a belief that the progressive humanitarian sort of open border version of Democrat was actually closer to the modal Democrat.
Right.
And as it's becoming more of an issue for Democrats, at least in Texas, we can say, we don't have to talk about nationally, it's looking like Cuellar's probably closer to the modal Democrat maybe on some of this stuff than sort of this, whether real or unreal, this sort of.
There's a lot of different things moving at once here, though, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want
your earlier explanation,
right? But then this idealized or version of some progressive Democrat and what they want on the border.
So, and if you look, more broadly speaking, I was just looking at this data yesterday for I think something a student was working on, but there's still a much higher share of people in the Democratic Party that identify as moderate, than in the Republican Party. Right. Now that number has gone down. That share has gone down beginning in about 2016.
Right.
But it's still the case.
Well, and again, but that also raises the difficult question of what does it mean to be a liberal on immigration?
Right. Well, and this was just general party ID, right? So or ideological identification crossed with party ID. So, one of the other fallouts of this is that, another aspect of this is the deployment of military resources that has been going on for the last 3 years. And by the way, this is the 3-year birthday of Operation Lone Star. So happy birthday, Operation Lone Star. has been very popular with Greg Abbott's base, but also now is, gaining a lot more traction among Democrats. Right?
Yeah, and that same February polling, 2/3 of voters said they approved of the deployment and sort of additional expenditures of military and police resources by the state to deal with border security. 90% of Republicans expressed support for this, 75% strong support. Among independents, it was 59%. And again, notably, given this discussion, among Democrats, 44% supported the deployment, 48% opposed the deployment. And so, there you go. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not much more to say than that's a good political issue, right?
Yeah, and then we see, and then the issue, the interesting thing by way of transition to this
Yes.
to our next point. But I mean, I think, we sort of, it's not without limit. I mean, I
Right.
think, and we've said in the podcast several times, I mean, I think part of what we've seen with Governor Abbott, with, in very much more public and much more extreme terms since the beginning of Operation Lone Star, is probing where the limits are.
Yeah.
Right. And so, we found a little bit of a limit. So in the last poll, we also asked about, the conflict between state forces and the Border Patrol.
Right. So we asked specifically, do you support or oppose the state of Texas preventing U.S. Border Patrol agents from accessing parts of the Texas-Mexico border, which has been going on, I think most notably in Eagle Pass. Well,
Right.
now this, again, this is a little bit different. If you're thinking the last couple of results, we saw about 2/3 support here. 41% said they supported this. 44% said they were opposed. Among Democrats, it was 25% support, which is still notable. Still 1 in 4,
Yeah.
still a lot. 62% opposed. For Republicans, it was 59 support, 28% opposed. And so now, look, this is a tough question, and we should just say right at the
Yeah.
beginning. Just as a quick,
There's a lot going on here.
as a quick pollster aside, in addition to what we've already said, asking people about their support or opposition to preventing someone from doing anything, support for something negative is always a little bit tricky in
yes.
polling. But I'd also say this is another one of those questions where you got to sort of ask yourself, how well formed is this attitude or opinion, right?
What are people really responding to?
And I think this is a difficult question because I think, there's likely the possibility that they might be responding to this in sort of different ways. Not in a way that I think, makes interpretation difficult. But if you think about, again, if I don't really have a strong feeling about this question in particular, what am I reacting to? Well, maybe if I'm a Republican respondent, maybe I'm reacting to this sort of state federal kind of idea, this idea that the federal government is, not doing its job. And I'm associating, and I also have to make the association between U.S. Border Patrol and that federal government, which is a little bit tricky. I think if you're a Democrat or an independent, if you've thought about this a lot, you've thought about it a lot. But if not, you might also just be thinking, wait, aren't they supposed to cooperate? Aren't they really, is that how this is supposed to work? But I also don't think this is something that people have really been faced with very much. I mean, the idea of, a state military force, police force, essentially prohibiting a federal, law enforcement agency from doing its job is, I don't want to say it's not uncharted, but it's certainly not, pretty unusual.
It's an example of, I was talking about a few moments ago, is like testing the boundaries here, from a policy perspective in terms of what the governor and what Texas state government is doing. I wouldn't, bet my future on, the replication, we'll have to, we can test it.
Yeah.
Right. But I can't help but think that, and I agree with you, like the pool of knowledge here is probably a little shallower.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of gray areas in here that, I think you laid out well. I don't need to repeat. That said, it makes a lot of sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
That the results here would be lower than in the other areas.
Yeah.
Even with, possible measurement, possible, problems with the measurement and the phrasing of the question, et cetera. When I look at these numbers, they make sense.
Yeah. I mean, look, the other thing I'd say is, I think the thing that makes this question sort of hard to square in some ways is, to me at least, I don't know if this is just, I would have thought before asking it, and I think this may be part of the response structure, but that the U.S. Border Patrol would still have a positive net affect among Republicans,
Right.
More so than among Democrats. I think that's part of also what might make this kind of difficult when you think about it, right? I mean, the U.S. Border Patrol has been kind of, the Border Patrol Union in particular has been kind of active in recent politics, especially at the national level,
right?
But to some degree, I think even more so at the state level. And there is something kind of weird about the sort of, unflinching support for sort of police and police agents, unflinching support for border security and the necessity of border security. And then this idea of limiting, the actual border patrols from engaging in the activity. And I think, I agree with you. I mean, the responses make sense, but to flip it around, you'd say, and yet 59% said this was good, right? That they supported this.
But I mean, 59% compared to
of Republicans, to be clear.
Yeah, compared to the 90% who agree with the deployment. So I mean, that's how you explain that gap, I think is an
Well, I think you're right. I mean, it is about
right.
there are boundaries, and we've talked about this before too. Just in terms of immigration enforcement, there tends to be almost a floor for sort of support among Republicans towards immigration enforcement, and until about the time you start talking about like separating children from their parents and things like that.
Right. That's the other example I was kind of thinking of.
And there are boundaries, right? They're pretty far out there, but they exist.
Yeah, and it may be even more conventional than, we're thinking here in the sense of, there's some people who goes like, look, I may think the federal government's doing a bad job, but should we really like not cooperate?
Right. Yeah.
The 59% of Republicans that agree. I mean, the interesting thing here is that in most of these cases, when we look at Republicans, independents, and Democrats, on most of these border issues, independents are usually in the middle, but more like we're closer to Republicans than the Democrats.
Yeah.
And this is the one question where the independents are actually closer to Democrats than Republicans. But that also, I mean, I think that underlines, in a way, the two different points that are kind of in tension here. One, that there may be some shallow knowledge here, which we can always kind of assume with independence.
Right.
But also that the gut level response is, well, that seems like a little much.
Well, the way that the way that I'd almost like to ask this question, but it has another set of problems, would be almost in the normative frame, which is basically to say, should Texas and the federal government be cooperating on immigration enforcement? Now, the problem with that, of course, is that it is a normative statement, and it does, I think, describe the state of the world in which most people expect things to already be operating, which is, of course, Texas and the federal government, work together on immigration enforcement. How could they not? And if you were to do that, I mean, it's sort of like, I don't think we would get like the mirror reverse of these numbers.
I don't either. Yeah. I mean, and we can, as I recall, we considered that.
We did consider that. We did consider that, but the problem is that in setting that up, in some ways what you're doing, you're forcing people to reject the normative statements.
Right.
Right. Whereas, and that's where you end up with this sort of, support preventing.
Yeah.
Right. Just to explain a little bit, But
Yeah,
you're right.
well.
But the shallow knowledge, I think, is the point here, to the extent that, I mean, this is a good way to just, again, it's like a little bit more of a polling podcast this time. But one of the ways to sort of think about whether knowledge is shallow or not is to think about the impact of question wording, right?
Right.
If an attitude is really deeply held, is really reinforced by, a number of attitudes that push in the same direction or reinforce each other, then changes in question wording shouldn't really have a huge impact on the distribution of responses.
As much as we would normally expect them to.
Yeah, which is not a ton anyway. But then if we go and say, well, what about an issue that you've never thought about, and now this is the question, well, then the question is going to have a big impact potentially on the way that people, generate an answer.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way I think about that is that, if your kind of policy knowledge of this or is shallow, or the question presents you as something that's, as you were kind of saying earlier, a novel issue, a novel cognitive object, right? What fills in the gap?
Right. Yeah.
Right. And what seems to me is like there's something filling in the gap here that makes independents and Democrats more like each other, and it probably is this notion of cooperation where Republicans, the issue's more salient to Republicans, their attitudes are more intense. In all the ways we've been talking about, and they're probably more primed to interpret this conflict on the side of the state.
Well, and they're not just being told repeatedly that Joe Biden's doing a bad job on the border. They're being told that he's purposefully doing a bad job on the border to let people in, basically, on purpose. They're cutting the barbed wire. They're suing the state,
Right.
And so if that's how you feel, well, that, you'd probably come to a different conclusion about cooperation.
And you're just a couple of steps there to the great replacement theory. So there are a lot of big implications here, as we kind of look at these various pieces for understandings of the Constitution, politics of the Supreme Court, Abbott's position in Texas, looking more close, thinking more narrowly about the Alito order yesterday, the way that this issue is now kept alive in a lot of ways, or the way that it's kept alive, no matter what they had ruled, it's going to be kept alive, I think, for a while. But it also, has raised another issue that we'll close with today, just, with a few thoughts that has been the subject of a somewhat strange resurgence in recent months. Although, I did some Google Analytics searches I forgot to put in the notes where I was going to share, where it's interesting to go back and look at the spikes in this. But, and this is on the notion of Texas seceding from the United States and the advocacy of the, quote unquote, Texas nationalist groups in Texas. And, we've glanced off this once or twice briefly in the podcast, and we've been talking a bit about it offline. But there has been a real spike in attention to this in recent months. And you and I think, I was kind of gut checking our experience when I went and did this Google Trends thing. And, we're not making it up.
Okay, good.
Right? I mean, you can see this, this spike over the last few months. Now, part of it was, dates back to the effort by, some forces within the Republican Party to get a Texit item on the primary ballot, which interestingly enough didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, same people, but
right, same people. And so I guess just to be explicit about it, we thought we'd talk about it a little bit. I mean, part of the operative hypothesis for linking these two things is that the conflict at the border has activated both Texas nationalists, such as they are, and attention to the whole notion of Texas secession. And a lot of this is coming from other states and, frankly, from other countries. We both talked to international reporters about this, though, as I dug into this, there's been no shortage of Texas coverage either.
Okay.
As a quick Google news search reveals. But, as I said, some of this was triggered, I think, pretty clearly back in the fall by this effort to get, this item on the ballot. But, there's a lot of things going on that are triggering this, I think. And that the border, issue right now is a real catalyst for that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one of the things that I would say is, if you've been an observer, a student of politics in the state, an observer, a participant or whatever, and if you go to, rallies from time to time, as part of your work or, whatever, just for fun, I don't know.
Vocation or avocation.
I can't think of a time I've been at a Republican event that hasn't had, signs, a table, something about Texas secession. It's not like it's a new issue, right? It's been around. But, at the same time, there is something going on in this moment. I mean, and some of it is, it's sort of, I think from our perspective, it's, at least from my perspective, I'll say, some of it is a little baffling, right? I mean, in terms of the attention that it's getting. I mean, there's an entire Newsweek whose cover is devoted to Texit and multiple articles on this subject. Over the last number of weeks in a way that in some cases, like, just sort of is. Yeah,
Newsweek has been very focused on this.
It's been very focused on,
that, are not entirely clear.
Well, in interpretive ways, sometimes it really, I think, I think show questionable judgment. We can come back to it if we want. I don't think we need to. But anyway, look, I mean, the thing is, there is a situation going on right here, right? The fight over authority at the border between Texas and the national government and the uptick in the intensity of that, right? All this stuff that we're talking about does create this, obvious point of conflict, right, between Texas and the federal government, and not like a hypothetical one in the courts, like between the police forces of the states.
Our earlier discussion,
right, and that's different, right? The intensity of sort of the ideological and partisan piece of this with a Democrat in the White House and Republican dominance of state government, it's also sort of hard to ignore. I mean, just as a quick, gut check about this, and I often ask reporters who want to talk about this is, would we be paying as much attention to this, or would secessionists be making such loud calls if Donald Trump wins?
Right.
And speaking of just to raise a theme we've raised multiple times, does that sound like a cognitively deep attitude then? Probably not, right? Yeah. I mean, if the political dynamics change, all of a sudden the idea of a complete divorce of Texas from the federal government sounds like less of a reasonable policy goal. Maybe we should ask about how strongly held of a policy goal that is.
Right.
Look, the role that Donald Trump is playing right now in consistently highlighting the border and highlighting immigration and highlighting, honestly, sort of racial and ethnic change.
Yeah, I mean, as a campaign issue, it is undeniably one of the central facets of Donald Trump's political identity.
And what it does is it makes, I think, and relatedly, in a lot of ways, it makes, I would say, the expression of underlying nativism that we've written about and talked about, in the Republican Party in Texas, it actually provides for a seemingly high-minded expression of what is generally nativism. That's a nice way to put it.
That's a funny way of putting it.
Well, but
I think I know what you mean.
Well, but it's more of like this is about philosophy. This is about the role of government. It's not about the changing demographics. It's not about the people coming over. This is about something else, something higher-minded.
In some guises, anyway. Yeah, sure.
Well, at least, I'll say among the proponents who are having the most success in getting media coverage around this, they're not talking about, the invasion, as much as they're talking about, again, state and federal authority, right? And then last, the other thing that brings this to bear is it's an interesting issue. And then on the one hand, it's almost irresistible, I think, in the sort of the politics of the state, right?
Yeah.
Because it plays into immigration, it plays into the state-federal conflict. And so in a lot of ways, I think, if it weren't, treason, I think there are a lot of like Republican elected officials who might jump on this that they didn't see, potential exposure and problems with it as sort of a path going forward, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of things. I mean, there's also, we should mention, it's really important to mention this. There's been some research and reporting on the degree to which Russian intelligence and disinformation efforts have actually worked to amplify Texas separatist movements. It's probably less of a factor than these broader big picture trends.
Yeah. I mean, I've been very interested in this and have dug around in this a lot. And I don't want to say it's the main motivator here because all these other things have deeper roots, but it's pretty well documented that one of the Russian tactics is to play up divisions, and they do this not just in the United States. Right?
Yeah, no.
I mean, it's kind of in the Russian the Russian foreign policy and counterintelligence playbook.
I mean, the Texas nationalist movement is a separatist movement in a competitor of Russia's, and so they are happy to amplify those voices as they would in any country that they have conflict with.
So, in terms of public opinion, we've been interested in this for a long time, and we've considered and discarded lots of different ideas for how to do this. I mean, it's very noisy to try to ask somebody on a survey about this, to my mind, and I think generally.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, one of the things that we try not to do is engage in, total hypotheticals.
Right.
So one of the things that I think, we do our best, I think, with, especially around policies, is, in some cases to be patient, and to wait till a policy actually exists or a policy vehicle. Otherwise to try to go and see what the underlying attitudes that might inform people's reaction to a policy. But one of the issues here is that, secession is not legal, right? I mean, it's very clearly illegal. The most conservative of Supreme Court justices, I mean, there's this very sort of famous quote of, from Antonin Scalia, basically saying the Civil War settled the legality question about secession. And I mean, if you want anyone who would maybe have the most open interpretation, it would probably be the late justice, right? So one, you'd have to ask people about whether they support, essentially something that's not technically legal. Right. That's the first thing. The other issue is this issue of sort of cost. And this is sort of what kind of gets lost in all these, I think, the proponents of sort of Texas secession and a lot of the media coverage.
A lot of hand-waving goes on. I mean, most reporters, when you raise this, go, no, I asked them about this. And what I got was hand-waving, essentially.
Well, I mean, and a reporter I spoke to recently, look, if you go back and read one of the main proponents' books, which I have not, maybe I will, apparently goes into great deal of detail about all of these, basically how all this stuff is going to be dealt with. But that's not the discussion we're having, and that's not the discussion that is that is not the political frame that's being put around this as part of the justification, rationale, and even evidence that this is a widespread view, because all of that discussion—
And if anything, it's inconsistent with a lot of the rhetoric.
Right, and it ignores, basically loss lost federal revenue, the impact on the economy, right? The impact on the movements of people within Texas, right? There's all kinds of possibilities out there that we could start thinking about, the water supply, who inspects food now in Texas, right? I mean, there's all a million things that come up, but ultimately that's not really for a survey question, right? It's sort of a yes or no, support, oppose kind of thing, because ultimately, going back to what we said before, if these aren't deeply held opinions, which I would say most people are not thinking about Texas becoming its own nation, then what ends up happening is that whatever you insert in the question is going to influence results a lot, right? So, the other piece here that nobody really talks about is trade-offs right now. I mean, I've said this to a bunch of reporters, but, many of the the most obvious proponents of Texas secession are very conservative generally in their political views. And the way that it's almost portrayed is, well, we just take what's great about the Texas government and then it just becomes the only government. And it's like, yeah, but like the Texas government would have to change dramatically if it became the only form of government, right? And it would involve new taxes, new fees, new responsibilities that would have to be decided on. So the very same people who are seemingly the target for secession would also be the ones who might be most aghast at how much bigger Texas government would need to become. Right. So, I mean, in short, I'd just say, it's an easy issue to get soft opinions on with like a necessarily gauzy question. Do you think Texas, could go on its own? Do you support or oppose Texas becoming its own country? Do you think, Texas could run itself better than, Washington, right? But at the same time, it also means that if we include anything like the possibility of physical violence, businesses leaving the state, increased taxes.
Yeah, how about an income tax? I expect that's going to dramatically change the responses. And in fact, even in the polling that, again, the separatist movement has commissioned on its own, you see that in their own polling from the first question they asked, which is sort of the gauzy version, to one that like proposes it might not be that easy. And then, it drops significantly. So what do we do? Well, it's pretty. What I was just giving all that set wind After
up.
giving you all that detail, we took a much more general approach.
Well, we did because it
was the underlying attitude approach.
Yeah, and so look, this is fairly indirect, but we repeated a question we asked 10 years ago, where we asked people, do they generally tend to think of themselves as American first and Texan second, or Texan first and American second, or they don't know. And what we found was in this survey in February of this year, 26% of Texans said they considered themselves Texan first, which again, not everybody's from Texas. Not surprising. It's also, but to the point of, how does this have to do? It's like, well, look, if you're thinking that Texas should be an independent nation, and part of this is this idea of Texas and Texanness and all that, we just kind of want to see what is sort of the base of people who see themselves as Texans, right? Yeah. And it's relatively high. I mean, you might say it's relatively low depending on how you think about it, but 1 in 4 Texans, 63% said they were American first. Among Republicans, who again we think is the fundamental group that is being targeted here, 57% said they were American first, 35% said they were Texan first. Among people who said they were extremely conservative, so this is the highest possibility, 53% said American first, 42% said Texan first. Now this doesn't mean the 26% of Texans would vote to secede from the Union. This does not mean the 26% of Texans would start voting for a secessionist party. It does not mean the 26% of Texans are in favor of secession. It simply means that they identify as Texan before American. Now, these numbers, interestingly enough, look pretty consistent with some better polling that was done on the direct question of succession, which found about the same share of Texans saying that they'd be open, again, in a kind of a gauzy way.
Open to
the idea of secession.
It gives us kind of it gives us an upper limit and does give us this is, again, one of those questions where you look at this and you think, pretty plausible.
Yeah.
In terms of, the party differences, the stability of it from when we asked the question,
mm-hmm.
10 years ago in a slightly different form.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, the point you make is right without, over elaborating. That 26% is, very roughly speaking, kind of the pool.
Yeah.
The pool of, if you were gonna target market some kind of a Texas independence movement, that's your pool.
Yeah. And
right. But as you say, importantly, you're not getting all of those, or, who knows? But
Well, and maybe I should just say, so I was just thinking about this as you're saying it, but like as imperfect as the question is, the flip side of the response is actually almost more important. Nearly 2/3 consider themselves to be American before Texan.
Yeah, and that
group is probably unlikely to vote for
right, and
secession.
have a lot of resistance, right? And that's why I'm saying this is the upper level of your pool. So
Right.
What do we think about this? I mean, I just think in terms of the uptick, to go back to the big list of reasons we started with, it's really hard to imagine this getting as much traction as it's been getting with a Democrat in the White House when we see a Republican in the White
Absolutely.
House again. And I would have to go and I need to go back and maybe look at that Google trend data and, divide it up by presidencies. But my guess is that would hold. Mm-hmm. And as you've said, one of the reasons this is, appealing to some people and on the ground is that there's not really been a robust public discussion about this. We're not really airing this out in any real way. And so all of those kind of trade-offs and all those conditional things in terms of a factual evaluation or a rigorous evaluation of the proposition, shall we say, is not really happening. And so what we're seeing is, another instance of, what we're seeing a lot right now, right? Which is, you've got, the groups that are living in the Republican Party right now have a lot more leverage on affecting, what's going on in the state because of, the uniform nature of Republican rule in the state.
Right.
And so...
And the dynamics of low turnout Republican primary
Right.
elections and safe seats that we talk about over and over again, which do magnify the power of small issue publics.
Right.
Or at least magnify their importance because they become the basis for, primary challengers.
And if you look at, and you look at, this is another issue where you see a lot of primary candidates try, particularly those, primary candidates, both incumbents and challengers, the word sovereignty of the state comes up a lot.
Yeah.
And sovereignty is an interesting word to use in this setting because, it's a little bit of a Rorschach.
Right.
You cannot at all take the idea of secession or independence seriously. But if you're a conservative and there's a Democrat in the White House, the term sovereignty for the state can resonate in the right way without going too far. But if you're a nationalist, you can see the word sovereignty and go, aha.
Yeah.
And I think, I was talking to a reporter that was kind of pointing, she and I were talking about this a couple days ago, and you see that pop up in this discussion among candidates who want to nod to this without buying into it.
Having said that, though, this is one of the things, I think one of the themes in this podcast is, or at least one of my themes, I guess, in the way that I look at things is, I look at elites and I look at their actions as a way to kind of, uncover for me what they're seeing and how they read a situation.
Yeah.
And one question that I always ask, reporters about this is, given the politics in the state, especially a reporter who's been following for a while and kind of knows the dynamics, and, given the politics of the state, given the dynamics we see in Republican primaries, do we really think that if, Greg Abbott's polling showed him that this was a good issue among Republican voters, 60% plus, he wouldn't pursue it? At least, I don't always pursue it in the sense of like, pursue exit, but he wouldn't flirt with it more than
Be giving it more of a nod.
And he's been pretty careful. He's been asked. I look back. He's been asked directly, and he's avoided sort of talking about it very directly. And even a lot of the candidates in the House, who even like there's some candidates who signed the pledge, basically saying they're for it. And again, kind of like vouchers. Where is it on their website? I don't know. It's not on the front.
Well, that's what I mean
for
about
sure.
The sovereignty references.
Exactly. And
like
so
that.
right now, this is important because I think there's sort of two things here that are I think worth saying. Like I don't think this is a big issue for most voters. I don't think it's a big issue for most Republicans. I think even among those for whom it is, a potential issue, I think for some large share of those, it's a little bit more demonstrative. I think about Democrats moving to Canada. It's like, yeah, they're mostly still here. You say these
Right.
things, right? Got it. Got it. I'll see you in Vancouver.
Yeah.
But it's like, yeah, but that's not.
The exit option is always a romantic fantasy more than it is a real reality.
But given I will say this. So first thing I want to say is this is a fantasy. In most cases, both in terms of the practicality of it, but especially in the way that public opinion is being described by the proponents of it, absent any sort of counterweight, as sort of this broadly popular thing. Not to mention the fact, mechanically, this is almost impossible. Like in the sense of like how our legislative process, even people who know this would not support this. You need Democratic votes, honestly, to make this even become something of a reality, or even put it before voters, all that kind of stuff. Having said that, this does look like a lot of other issues. I mean, it does look like a lot of issues that seem sort of fringe in the Republican Party that, get magnified in Republican primaries and become something that need to be dealt with. Now, that doesn't mean it makes it through the legislature, as a lot of things don't. But, do I think that someone's going to be filing, their secession constitutional amendment?
Because they usually do.
Because they usually do, and they'll do it again, right? Does this change? And again, and when it happens, Newsweek is going to come along and say, "Oh, Texas secessionists get one step closer to their goals," and it's like, did you go back and look to see whether they?
How many times they've taken that step?
Yeah, think, just a little, just a little check. So I don't want to say this is just like a dead issue, or this isn't something that's going to, crop up at some point in the future, because it does feel like a lot of Republican issues. But the current discussion around it is so divorced from, I think, the reality. And I mean, part of this is just, I'll end my part with this, which is say, patriotism, American exceptionalism, especially, what American identity means, which is a big topic unto itself, pretty big weights in the Republican Party, and in conservatism in particular. And so, I haven't heard a really good argument as to how we square those things away, that this is both, on the one hand, this allegedly very, very popular movement with, tons of support both within the Republican Party, beyond the Republican Party, but how that squares away with, an idea that, Donald Trump and Republicans are saving America because American exceptionalism, patriotism, cultural identity are so important and things that need to be saved. And to me, those things are just so obviously in conflict with each other.
Yeah, and I think that what we're seeing, in this recent rash of coverage is that, where the better of these stories wind up is saying, is moving away from what nationalists want as a reality, to trying to figure out what it means that they're so persistent and that they have a home, increasingly within one of the political parties. And I think, that's the more interesting element of this. But it is tricky, I think, for people to kind of tackle the story and not get sucked into the reality, which is, pretty minimal of it as a prospect,
right?
To minimal to zero, as you're saying.
It's not a good hook, as they say.
Right.
In the story.
But at the same time, try to tease out what this tells us about what's going on in the state, what's going on in the party, and what it is, in a much more, in the kind of cosmic sense that I hate. But it's hard to avoid. What is it about, Texas that this kind of a sentiment is just so durable, and the obvious historical explanations, but it's an interesting question about how it continues to get recharged, and I think that is productive to figure out where that charge comes from, right? And we touched on a little of that, and
it comes from Newsweek. I told you,
and maybe we'll figure out a way to do that. So with that, thanks again to Josh for being here. Thanks to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. As always, you'll find results we talked about, interpretations, discussion of today's podcast on the web at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. And, of course, thank all of you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.